And so today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 5. So we are still in the book of Daniel, and we are at chapter 5. And we're just going to dive right into it, and then I'll give a little bit of a spiel. So we're going to start at Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and concubines drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand of the royal palace. The king watched as the hand wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, the diviners, and he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck. And he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So Belshazzar became even more terrified and his face grew even more pale than his nobles were baffled. The queen, upon hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams and explain riddles and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Okay, so first thing I want to talk about right off the bat is how many of you are familiar with this story? You've heard the story of the writing on the wall before. Yeah. It's funny because I was like, as I was preparing for this, it's like, I think most of us are familiar with the story, but I don't know if I've ever actually heard anyone preach about the writing on the wall before. I don't know why. It's just not as a popular story to talk about. And in fact, whenever I think about this particular story, my fondest memories of it are from the Hanna-Barbera cartoon. You guys know which one I'm talking about? No? Okay, we'll have to watch it. They're little half-hour segments. And one of the ones so Hanna-Barbera made this cartoon, I think it's called The Greatest Adventure series, and it's just Bible stories. And it's these 3 time-traveling kids who inadvertently are time-traveling because they fall into this thing, and they get sent to these Bible stories, and so they're living through them as they're going on. And this one always stuck out in my mind what was happening. And so what is happening? Well, first, you notice that King Nebuchadnezzar is now gone. We literally went from last week, King Nebuchadnezzar is being drove crazy, and then it was the great redemption story. Remember? He was going crazy, he exalted himself, he loved himself, he did all this stuff, God made him mad, but when he went to God and said, "God, you are King of kings and Lord of lords," when he found humility and he allowed himself to exalt God instead of calling out to Marduk, instead of calling out to Nergal and all these other Babylonian gods, instead he called out to the King of kings and Lord of lords, then God restored him to his position, and he actually continued to reign until his death. Eventually, though, King Nebuchadnezzar did die. We know from history that he died in 562 BC. And this is where things get interesting. So in the Bible, right, we literally just read, okay, and now there's Belshazzar. And we go, oh, okay, so his son took over. That's not quite what happened. There's actually a very turbulent 8 years of Babylonian history where they go through several kings. Things are getting really, really bad, as usually happens, right? You have a great and powerful king. He's ruling the empire with an iron fist. He brings them to their greatest prosperity, greatest affluence. Things have never been as good for Babylonians as they have under Nebuchadnezzar. And then when he dies, there's this huge mad scramble for power. And so they end up going through several kings, and eventually there's this man named Nabonidus. Now, of course, you're like, who's Nabonidus? The Bible didn't talk about him. Nabonidus is the actual biological father of Belshazzar. But King Nebuchadnezzar was essentially the godfather of Belshazzar. Okay? King Nabonidus is the last legitimate king of Babylon. But King Nabonidus, he wasn't a very good king either, right? That's usually what ends up happening, right? We see it in the history of the Jews. We see it in the history of all great empires. Usually there's one great leader who brings them to maximum affluence. Things become very, very good, and then everything usually goes downhill from there because it's one of those things, right? And we see this in North American society today, right? Think about it. We literally have, here in North America, we're quite blessed, whether you believe it or not, and I'm going to say the uncomfortable bit out loud, we're very blessed to be next door to America because, holy smokes, the economic engine that was built by the greatest generation, right, the generation before the boomers, they sacrificed so much, worked so hard to create the single greatest economic engine on the planet that is so much more powerful that at the time it was more powerful than every other economic system combined. Today it is, of course, in decline, and yet it's still, because it's so powerful, it's still the most powerful economic system on the planet, right? As Canadians, we are quite blessed to be right next door to this because we've worked hand in hand for such a long time, and it's allowed us to live in relative splendor and goodness. Things have been really, really good for us. Like, think about it. Which one of us can say we remember a time before we had, access to things like roads or cars or electricity? And yet these are things that are still, just being introduced to parts of the world. There are places in the world that are still inaccessible by car, and not for terrain purposes, but just for financial purposes. Think about where we live today and the cries that we hear from people about housing should be a human right, or access to the internet is a human right. And it's like, what? Like, there are literally places in the world that do not have internet. What is it? I think that something like close to 1 billion people on the planet do not have access to the internet. And I'm not talking about a computer in their home. I mean, they couldn't access it even if they wanted to. There are people all around the world who, it's funny because we talk about housing being a human right. Our homeless live better than a lot of people around the world. Like, that's incredible to me. Like, that's how affluent of a society we have become. We are so rich and so powerful a culture, right? We can actually identify and understand what's going on here with Babylon. But eventually, the problem is, after great leaders, you usually tend to have weak leaders take over. Why? Because they didn't have to work for it. They didn't work hard. They didn't have to earn it. They were handed it. And when you're just handed something, you don't have the same appreciation for the cost and what it takes to get there. And that's exactly what happened with the entire empire of Babylon. As these kings, as these men continue to fight over the kingdom, eventually Nabonidus grabs hold of the reins, and he's just kind of in coasting mode. So why are we reading about King Belshazzar? Because although Belshazzar technically wasn't the king, he was a regent who regarded himself as a king because he essentially did his dad's job while his dad was off gallivanting around the empire doing whatever it was that he wanted. Right? He was like, I'm the king, I can do what I want. And so Belshazzar essentially became the de facto king, and he took on this mantle, elevating himself not just as a godson of Nebuchadnezzar, but elevating himself to son, because then that would give him some real credit or real claim to the throne, and it gave him a real credibility. And you got to remember, at this point, Babylon is the ruler of the world. As far as they're concerned, they rule from the Nile River all the way to the Persian Gulf. The world is their oyster. They own it. They have conquered it. It is under their subjugation. We are the masters. And so he doesn't have any understanding of what it took to grow it to that size. Not only that, it's funny because it's understandable as a young person, as you're growing up in this empire. Maybe you're not going to ask a lot of questions about how things happened the way that they did. But you would think, because at this point in this story, King Belshazzar has been in control for 2 years. Okay, 2 years. and he still doesn't know one of his royal court officials, Daniel, who is still the head of all the astrologers, diviners, and wise men in all of Israel, right? He still holds that position, and he still doesn't know him. This is going to tell us a lot about who King Belshazzar was. It's also worth noting as well, what were the gold and silver vessels that were brought out, the gold and silver goblets it's referred to. And of course, these were items that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem back under the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And since King Belshazzar wasn't a real king, he seems to have developed this real inferiority complex, right? And we know this, by the way, not just from the Bible, but we can read other carvings, other tablets, other engravings that have been left behind from the Babylonian era. And we know King Belshazzar, he was a terrible king, and he had a real complex. He kind of lived similarly to his father, although in the capital, where he just felt, I'm the king, I'll do what I want, when I want, how I want. I say all this for us to understand what the situation is and what exactly is going on. See, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was at least able to find humility and allow himself to be redeemed. It was one of the great stories of the Bible. And in fact, he never used these relics that were dedicated to the worship of God for anything else. He had them put away in storage. It was part of the things that they captured, but he never used them for anything else, because as he grew in his understanding of how powerful God was, he also grew in respect and understood, I should not desecrate anything that belongs to the Lord. But here at this feast, we have Belshazzar taking the very things that were dedicated solely for the worship of God and instead desecrating them to exalt both himself as well as partake in idol worship, worshiping these gods of iron, gold, silver, bronze, wood, and stone. And after everything that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, you would think maybe Belshazzar would know better. But clearly he does not. And he makes this fatal flaw. For what? Just so that he could enjoy a little bit of pleasure in this fleeting moment. Just so he could feel good about himself, blow up his ego, and show off just who he was. He wasn't willing to learn. And as a result, this hand comes and writes this message on the wall, and fear is the right response. When God shows up and does something like this, we should have a fearful response. We should understand. And so we're going to go to verse 13 here. Verse 13, it says, so Daniel was brought before the king, right? So they call for him, they bring him. And the king says, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father brought from Judah? I have heard the spirit of the gods is in you, that you would have insight and intelligence and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters brought before me to read the writing the wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read the writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. So now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys, ate grass like an ox. His body was drenched with with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and set over him anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines drank from them. You praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, wood, iron, and stone, which you cannot see or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life in all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote this inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Depending on which translation you have. Some say, I think it's Haparsin or something like that. But you'll see what we're getting at here in a second. Verse 26, it says, here is what the words mean. Mene. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck. He was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylon, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. When God gives a word, it is good, it is trustworthy, it is reliable. You can count on it. When God gives a promise, we know it can be trusted. And see, God abides a lot. And quite often, we hear from the culture at large, by the way, the culture at large around us who refuses to read the Bible, refuses to pick up the Bible, but they're going to pass judgment on the Bible and on God anyway. And quite often we hear people say things like, well, God is petty. They'll say things like, well, look, all Belshazzar did, he mistakenly used a few relics for himself. All he did was drink some wine out of these things. I mean, how bad is that really? How is this really worth the death penalty? And although we're not told much about Belshazzar in the Bible, a lot was known, as I mentioned before, a lot was known about his behavior at the time. And a lot is known still today about Belshazzar, which is funny because, as I mentioned before, right, we don't often hear about the negative sides of kings unless they're exceptionally crazy, right? I brought up Caligula as the example. Caligula was really crazy as one of the Caesars of Rome. He built a massive ship in the middle of a pond just because he could. He used to throw lavish parties. I think he was the one who attacked the sea. He literally sent soldiers to go attack the sea, and people died because he sent them into the ocean. Like, he was crazy, and so was Belshazzar. Belshazzar was known for his boorish behavior, for his life of excess and pleasure. He was not known as a good governor. He was not a good king for the people. He was, in fact, recognized by many of the leaders at the time as a terrible leader, and this final act of defiance before God was just the final straw. What we're reading about here in Scripture was just the last thing. And as you can see, God will abide a lot, but eventually justice is served. And the problem is, as much as we'll hear people say and clamor and call for justice, if we're really honest with ourselves, justice isn't really what we want. Do you really want to get what you deserve? Right? Think about that for a moment. Do you really want to get what you deserve? Do you really want to balance the scales of justice in your own life? I've heard people, and this one actually really shocked me, but I've even heard secular people making this claim, especially atheists, they'll make this claim. They'll say, God is actually unethical for the way that he punishes people by banishing people to hell, because they'll say even Hitler, who is the most deserving of hell, would eventually, whether it be 1 million, 2 million, 1 billion years, would eventually have paid off his debt. And for that, I say, not only would I disagree, but I don't think people really have an understanding of how bad evil is, how bad sin is. See, here's the trouble. We try and cutesy up sin, and we try to make sin seem less than it is. But sin is terrible. And it's these little evils, the little things that we partake in that maybe feel good in the moment, right? It allows us some form of pleasure or some sort of self-gratification. But eventually it brings destruction. It brings division, much like we read about here in Babylon. And we can look at and we can see the exact same thing is happening today, how things are breaking down and there's division in our own country. Because as we allow these little things to take root, allow these little things to take hold, and we abandon the principles that God gave us, then divisions sow in. Because guess what? If everyone can decide for themselves what is good, what is honorable, what is true, then eventually you and I are going to have a conflict because something that I enjoy is something someone else doesn't, or something that someone else thinks is wrong. So how did all of this happen? And it's simple. It's hedonism, this vast, this passionate pursuit of pleasure that has allowed both Babylon and our nation to begin to crumble. Right? Babylon was obviously, they obviously were at the peak of affluence. They had gone full bore into this passion of pleasure. We're obviously not quite there yet. I still think that there's a chance at redemption. But the problem is that the more that we make survival easier, the more that we make survival simple, right? Like, let's face it, how many of us have really considered whether or not we have what it takes to survive until tomorrow? Right? Like, that's not really something that we're worried about right now. And yet, there are places in the world, and most of human history, that has been the truth. Will I make it through the next day? But as we've made life simpler and easier and less challenging to go through, then what do we go after? We lean into this desire, this seeking of pleasure. And pleasure, of course, isn't always good, because it's not a good end goal to set. Right? Here's the trouble, right? When we're setting a goal for our life and we're saying, this is what I want to live for, if all you're living for is pleasure, is to feel good, is to be self-gratified, is to get what you want so I can feel good in the moment, the trouble is that's going to break down over time. Right? What is a more noble goal? What is a more what is the goal that Jesus set up for us, that God set up for us since the beginning, is our flourishing, right? And think about this. This is exactly what the greatest generation did. They were willing to sacrifice. They were willing to give up. They were willing to go without so that the next generation would flourish. And I think we can say, without much argument, the baby boomer generation that came in after, they flourished. Right? The North America in the 1950s and 60s was a flourishing nation. It was a crazy good economy. Right? It wasn't perfect. I'm not saying it was perfect, but we can say, like, look, they were willing to sacrifice so that way their children would have it better than they did. That's a good goal, a worthy goal. And yet, look at today. And how many people do you know that are, by the age of 25, up to their neck or over their head in debt? They're not able to pay off their student fees. They're not able to pay their credit cards. They're not able to get out from under a line of credit. Why? Because they chased what felt good at the time. How many of those same people, and maybe some of us are here today, maybe how many of those same people were still the people that went to Tim Hortons every day and said, well, it's only $2. It's only a little thing, right? But that's the problem. The little things amount to big things. And this is exactly what happened in Babylon. Right? As I said before, we live in a world where we cutesy it. I wasn't speeding that much, but you were speeding. I only stole something small. This became a big thing during COVID, right? It was this thing at self-checkouts where people were like, "Oh, you know what? I don't like Loblaws. They're a big multinational company. And they make all this money. They're just ripping me off. So I'm going to steal meat from them. I'm going to steal produce from them. I'm going to steal gum from them." Well, that makes you a thief. I only littered this one little cup because there's no garbage can. It was their fault, their reason. I only get drunk on Fridays. But guess what? You're an alcoholic. Guess what? You're a thief. Guess what? You're breaking the law. We make excuses for bad behavior. And when a Christian like myself calls it out, oftentimes we would get called, well, you're a Puritan. All someone like myself must want is to oppress other people, make people live under my rule. But on the contrary, I don't want that at all. I don't want people to live in oppression. I want people to flourish. And in order to do that, we need to fight against our own worst enemy, ourselves. See, we make really bad decisions all the time. This isn't a unique problem to Belshazzar, right? This isn't a unique problem to this Babylonian king. We all make terrible decisions all the time. And if you're saying to yourself, I don't, then I would say, you're lying, because we do. We make bad decisions all the time. We make bad, rash, impulsive decisions. And we're not so good at doing things in life as we think we are. So what do we do about it? How can we fix this? What changes can I make in order that we could have flourishing? What will bring flourishing to my world, to my community, to my church? What will bring flourishing? And I'll tell you exactly what it is. Once again, we come back to submission to authority, to God's authority. See, the rules that God handed down to us, as we go through the scripture and we read all these rules and stuff like that, and people are like, there's just so many rules. Why would I have to follow them? First off, I want to make it very clear. We're not talking about salvation right now, okay? We are not talking about salvation. Salvation is only attained through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That's it. But why, as we get into Deuteronomy and we're seeing the retelling of the law, as we go through the book of Leviticus and Numbers, as we go through the original passing down of the law in the book of Exodus, and as we look at all these things, we look at all these rules, what did God say was the reason for all this? He said, so that it would go well in the land that I have made for you, and that you would flourish, you would prosper. Why do we have these rules? Because we're really bad at making decisions. We're really bad at doing our own choices. And if we have God there to help us, to give us guidance, give us leadership, to show us the proper path, then we too can flourish. But it means submitting to authority. See, arrogance makes us blind to the truth, just like King Belshazzar. He had all the truth around him, right? He knew what Nebuchadnezzar went through. He knew what had happened to the kingdoms. He knew what happened when God showed up in the past. And yet, he allowed his own arrogance to grow so great and allowed himself to be so blind to the truth that he couldn't see it right in front of him. He knew that God showed up for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He knew God showed up for Daniel and gave him the vision of the dream. He knew that God drove Nebuchadnezzar mad and then redeemed him. He knew all of these things, and yet he still did not submit to the authority of God. He allowed his arrogance to blind him. Why? Because just like we do today, because we're going to live forever. This prosperity will just go on. Why wouldn't it? Why would things change? By the way, I don't really believe that, but you know what I'm talking about. That's the attitude of the culture. Why? You know, it's one of those things where people say, well, you know, everyone should be housing should be a human right. And it's like, okay, well, are you going to force people to make houses for other people? Because that's the only way houses get made. Houses don't just appear, right? How are you going to make these things happen? And it's just people don't have a grasp on reality, on what it takes for things to happen, for things to work. Why? Because why should it change? See, the problem, as Claire and I we've been watching the show on Netflix, The Life on Our Planet. It's talking about how life has changed on our planet over all the years and stuff like that. And there's always one key element. There's always a bigger fish. There's always a bigger shark. There's always a bigger predator out there that's looking to take you down. And that's one thing that we tend to forget as we live here in North America is things are so good. Things have been going so well, right? King Belshazzar fell for the same trap. Things are going so well. Babylon is so big, so powerful. We are invulnerable. And yet, the very next day, the Medo-Persian Empire storms in, conquers Babylon, and the end of Babylon happens overnight. Like that. In the end, the sharks are always circling. In the end, the predators are always looking for an opportunity to strike. And when we let down our guard, and when we're not paying attention to what God has called us to, and when we don't allow ourselves to be humble and pay attention, the kingdoms fall. Barbarians are at the gate. We are attacked and we are doomed. So what is the cure? Humility. We must practice humility. We have to submit ourselves under the authority of God for our own good. Right? We're not submitting ourselves under authority to live under some sort of religious dictator. We're submitting ourselves under the authority of God because out of the abundance of love that God had in his perfect formation, he created humanity that we would be able to live in relationship with him because he loves us so much. He gave us a way to live that we would prosper, that we would grow greater and greater and greater. But unfortunately, somewhere along the way, we developed this real God complex that said, I'm the moral authority. I have the power. I have the knowledge. I understand more than you, O God. To the point where we get to today where it's become common practice to say, God, you don't even exist. But see, God's ways have always been about his love for us. Whether we're talking about the very beginning of Genesis or the very end of Revelation, it's always been about his love and his passion for us. He cares about us deeply. He knows us better than anyone. He wants us to succeed. He wants us as humanity to flourish. And I want us to understand, once again, flourishing is different than pleasure. Flourish requires sacrifice. Flourish means denying ourselves the things that we want in the moment for future prosperity. And the trouble is that if we're arrogant, it's hard to hear that. If we don't shelve our own arrogance, if we don't put it to the side, if we don't realize that someone outside of ourselves would even care about us enough to allow us to prosper, then we cannot truly understand that. And yet this is exactly what God has put up on offer. See, the trouble is when we read about this happening to Belshazzar, are we willing to take it seriously? As Christians, we should know better. We have the stories. We have the warnings. And guess what? Belshazzar isn't the only one that we see this with, right? We see it again and again and again through the Bible. This is a pattern of behavior that we should be well familiar with, which should show us just how important it is that we lean on God. Again, I want to make sure I'm very clear about this. I'm not saying that we need to earn our salvation. I don't think that living a life following the rules, doing the things that God has called us to, is what calls us to salvation. But I am saying that there is a difference between accepting the salvation of the cross of Jesus Christ and saying that you've accepted the salvation of the cross of Jesus Christ. Just because you confess it with your lips doesn't mean that it's in your heart. As James said in his very controversial book of the Bible, faith without works is dead. If you say you believe in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, that what God has for us is so much infinitely better than anything that we could provide for ourselves, then why aren't you living it? Right? If what God calls us to is so good, why wouldn't we want to live that way? Why wouldn't we want God to shape our future, God to shape our reality? So let's not be a fool. Right? You want to know how you ought to live, you want to know what you ought to do? Take that book, that Bible. There's one in every single pew here, every single row here today. I'm assuming all of you have one at home. Take it and read it. Understand it. Know what it says and know how God would want you to live. Because it's only if you're willing to do that, it's only if you go and read for yourself, decide for yourself, that you'll get the answers that you're looking for. Because at the end of the day, it was Jesus who said that one day we're all going to be standing before the great white throne. We're all going to be judged for the things that we've thought, for the things that we said, for the way that we acted, for the things that we've done. What is God going to say to you? Right? I remember we used to always make this joke, is God going to say to you, well, you just barely squeaked in? Or is he going to look at you and say, well done, good and faithful servant? Which life do you want to live? Which choice are you going to make? So let's humble ourselves and allow God to transform our lives.